I would like to introduce the last session today, and it comes from this idea of we are in the context where different seasons are shaping differently the food composition, and we want to ask the question, if a 5-year-old wine is tasted today, how was it tasting like when it was just bottled, and how can we learn from the climatic effect at shaping the food composition, at predicting whether or not there will be a good aging potential. So really the questions we are trying to tackle is how can we leverage on those conferences to develop an understanding of season effect at shaping the wine aging potential. So how was 2012 tasting like right after bottling versus how is it tasting like today? And hopefully we can use that messages in order to maybe shift a little bit our winemaking practices when we make wine in 2017 with the goal in mind to have it aged for 10 or more years. So in order to put some context before Daniel comes and moderates the session, I just wanted to give you a brief reminder of the 2012. And you see it bears some similarities with 2017. First of all, the rain. You see that the rain level were relatively moderate or low. So that means that during period 1, we had, in some instances, maybe only a partial refill of the root reservoir. And it's similar to 2015. If we look at thermal time before bud break, what's interesting is that this is maybe one of the last vintage before we entered into the era of warm winter, so pre-global warming. So that's interesting, and I think it echoes a little bit the talk from Elizabeth, because we will see how soil temperature, unlike thermal time, might be more relevant to predict the phenological stages. Period 2, the period that sets the stage for the leaf area development. Well, you remember when we were positioning our vintage map, it's very important to look at how much water we get during this very rapid shoot growth period. Well, there was not so much in 2012. So think chances are high for having water deficit and maybe nitrogen deficit at the end of period 2, which we know to some extent can be beneficial for the wine composition. Similarly, if we look at the thermal time during the grain growth, period 2, we see that it's relatively low compared to recent years. And again, this is for me a footprint that we are dealing with the last pre-global warming vintage. And that's going to be interesting because then we may have to shift our practices accordingly to match the warming of the temperature. So what we had discussed at the vintage report in 12 is that climatically speaking, conditions were there to enhance an early water deficit. And in terms of vine response, we checked that earlier we had reached a maximum level of canopy that was smaller. And we also had vines that needed more water earlier simply because of the restriction in terms of root reservoir refill. Heat wave wise, this is ridiculously nice. You know, if we count the number of days where the vapor pressure deficit is greater than 3.5 kilopascal, when you start to feel a little bit like it's a heat wave. There was not even 6 days, such days on average in Napa Valley. Now we are looking at 40 days per season. So that was really the pre-drought era. So for that, it means that the conditions were there to maybe preserve aroma, preserve acids, unlike what we have more recently with current vintages. So the conclusion, before we listen to our panelists, is in 2012 we walked away with the fact that in some instances people did overreact and over-irrigated, which was conducive to vintage growing conditions that actually were more rich in terms of water than 2011, which was a very wet year. And the carryover effect from this over-response was a slower bricks accumulation, greener seeds, and higher susceptibility to dehydration. In response to that, the 2012 discussions said that food composition reflected the fact that there was a lot of spatial contrast between vineyards. So when we were looking at your NDVI maps, you saw that the patchwork of colors was much contrasted. That's because during period 2, differences in water supply induced very wide differences in terms of shoot length, which further on translated into more spatial variation, more spatial contrast within your vineyards. Low heat wave frequency, low spring rain, which favor early water deficit, and in general, a moderate heat accumulation. So when you bring all of that together into our maps, you understand why 2012 is here in the low spring rain year, which favors deficit. You see that in terms of heat accumulation, we are right in the middle. So it's a vintage that's not as stressful as 2008, 2015, or 2017. And you see that the low heat wave frequency qualified the 2012 vineyards as a pre-global warming era because it's still green. We only had a low frequency of heat waves with probably good condition for aging. If I tie the talk that we had a few years ago regarding susceptibility to producing dry fruit aroma in response to heat wave, well, probably 2012 was not really conducive to those dry fruit aromas.